In the grand halls of Valdoria Palace, where golden chandeliers cast dancing shadows on marble floors, tradition runs deeper than blood. For 300 years, the royal guard has stood as silent sentinels, their lives bound by ancient oaths never to speak unless spoken to, never to touch royalty unless in mortal danger, and never, ever, to feel anything beyond duty. Captain Marcus Blackwood believed in those rules with every fiber of his being. At 28, he was the youngest captain in the Guard's history, his dark eyes as sharp as his sword, his loyalty absolute. He had trained since childhood for one purpose: to protect the royal family with his life. But, on one rain-soaked autumn evening, when fate collided with destiny in the palace gardens, everything Marcus thought he knew about duty, honor, and his own heart would shatter like glass against stone. Because sometimes, saving a life means risking everything you've ever believed in. This is the story of how a single moment of heroism unraveled centuries of tradition, sparked a kingdom's greatest scandal, and proved that love recognizes no crown, no class, and no rules written by men who never had to choose between their oath and their heart. The morning mist clung to the towers of Valdoria Palace like secrets refusing to be told. Captain Marcus Blackwood stood at his post beside the grand entrance, his polished armor catching the first rays of sunlight that managed to pierce through the autumn bloom. 28 years old and, already bearing the weight of command, Marcus embodied everything the Royal Guard represented: discipline, honor, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. The palace around him was stirring to life with the quiet efficiency that had marked royal mornings for centuries. Servants moved like ghosts through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead kings, their footsteps muffled by crimson carpets that had witnessed more history than most kingdoms could claim. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from the kitchens, mixed with the lingering fragrance of night-blooming jasmine from the Queen's private gardens. Marcus had been born into this world of whispered conversations and careful protocols. His father before him had served as a guardsman, and his father before that. The Blackwood name was synonymous with service to the crown, carved into the very foundation of palace tradition. From the age of 7, Marcus had trained in the palace yards, learning not just the art of sword and shield, but the far more complex dance of court life where a misplaced word could spark international incidents and a gesture could topple governments. The Royal Guard numbered only 50, each man handpicked not just for his skill with weapons, but for his ability to become invisible when necessary, to see everything while appearing to notice nothing. They were the shadows that protected the light of the monarchy, and Marcus had never questioned his place among them until this morning when everything began to change. Princess Elena Valdoria was not supposed to be awake at dawn. Royal protocol dictated that members of the immediate royal family maintain schedules that reflected their station, rising at 9, breaking fast at 10, and beginning official duties no earlier than 11. But Elena had never been one to follow the rules written by others, especially when those rules seemed designed more to control than protect. At 23, she possessed a beauty that artists struggled to capture and poets failed to describe adequately. Her auburn hair caught light like spun copper, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence and compassion in equal measure. But it was her spirit that truly set her apart from the decorative princesses of neighboring kingdoms. Elena had been educated alongside her brothers, spoke 4 languages fluently, and understood statecraft with a clarity that sometimes unnerved even her father the king. This morning found her in the palace library, a vast chamber that housed over 50,000 volumes collected across centuries of Valdorian rule. Leather-bound tomes reached from floor to ceiling, their golden spines creating a maze of knowledge that Elena had been exploring since childhood. She sat curled in a window seat, morning light illuminating the pages of a book on agricultural reform, her silk nightgown and robe a stark contrast to the scholarly intensity with which she absorbed every word. The library had always been Elena's sanctuary, the one place in the palace where she could think freely without the constant weight of expectation pressing down upon her shoulders. Here, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, she could momentarily forget that her every action was scrutinized, her every word analyzed for political implications, her very existence reduced to a bargaining chip in the great game of international relations. She was deep in a passage about crop rotation when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the marble corridors outside. Elena recognized the distinctive cadence immediately, heavy boots moving with military precision, the soft chink of chain mail beneath formal tunics. The guard was changing shifts, which meant the morning briefing would begin soon, followed by the endless parade of meetings, fittings, and ceremonial duties that defined royal life. With a sigh that held more weight than any 23-year-old should carry, Elena closed her book and prepared to transform from a curious young woman into Princess Elena, heir presumptive to the throne of Valdoria. The transformation was one she had mastered through years of practice, but it never became easier. Somewhere between her private self and her public persona lay a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. Meanwhile, in the guard quarters located in the palace's eastern wing, Captain Marcus Blackwood was conducting his own morning ritual. The guards' quarters were spartanly furnished but impeccably maintained, reflecting the military discipline that governed every aspect of their lives. Marcus stood before a mirror that had reflected the faces of countless guardsmen over the decades, adjusting the gold braiding on his midnight blue uniform with the precision of a man who understood that details mattered in a world where appearances could mean the difference between peace and war. His reflection revealed a face that had earned respect throughout the palace, though he remained unaware of the whispered conversations among the female staff about his striking features. Dark hair was kept regulation short, and gray eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had seen enough of palace intrigue to understand its dangers but remained untouched by its corruptions. A scar along his left jaw, earned during training with the Master-at-Arms, only served to emphasize the strength of character that had elevated him to his current position. The morning briefing took place in the guard commander's office, a circular chamber dominated by detailed maps of the palace grounds and the surrounding city. Commander Harrison, a veteran of 30 years' service whose gray beard spoke of wisdom earned through experience, stood before a detailed schedule that would govern the day's activities. "The king meets with the Northland ambassadors at 2, Commander Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Princess Elena has a dress fitting at 11, followed by lunch with the ladies' auxiliary. "Prince Thomas returns from his tour of the southern provinces this evening, and the Duke's family arrives tomorrow for the Harvest Festival planning sessions." Marcus absorbed every detail, his mind automatically calculating guard positions, potential security concerns, and the complex choreography required to keep the royal family safe while allowing them to fulfill their duties. The Harvest Festival was always a challenging time for security, bringing together nobles from across the kingdom along with foreign dignitaries and carefully vetted citizens. The celebration that marked Valdoria's agricultural prosperity also created numerous opportunities for those who might wish harm upon the royal family. "Captain Blackwood," Commander Harrison continued, "I'm assigning you to Princess Elena's detail for the next several days. Sir Geoffrey is dealing with a family emergency and won't return until after the festival. I trust one don't need to remind you of the protocols regarding royal protection." Marcus straightened, accepting the assignment with the same composed professionalism he brought to every duty. "Of course, Commander. I understand completely." But understanding the protocols and preparing for their emotional impact were two entirely different matters, as Marcus would soon discover. The Royal Guard protocols regarding the protection of female royalty were both comprehensive and deliberately restrictive. Contact was to be minimal and purely functional. Conversation was limited to security matters and direct responses to royal commands. Personal interaction was forbidden, and any guard who showed signs of developing inappropriate attachments to those under his protection faced immediate dismissal and permanent banishment from the kingdom. These rules existed for good reason, forged through centuries of experience with the dangerous complexities that arose when duty and desire intersected. The royal bloodlines had been protected not just by swords and shields, but by the careful maintenance of social boundaries that prevented the chaos that could result from emotional complications within the palace walls. As Marcus made his way through the palace corridors toward his new assignment, he passed beneath tapestries that depicted the great moments of Valdorian history. Battle scenes showed his predecessors in the guard standing firm against invasion and rebellion, their faces stoic and resolute. Court scenes revealed guardsmen standing like statues while momentous decisions shaped the fate of nations. In every image, the guards remained apart, present but separate, vital but invisible. The palace itself seemed to whisper reminders of duty and tradition with every step. Marble floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps created a path that connected past to present, while portraits of former kings gazed down with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. The very air seemed thick with the weight of history, carrying expectations that stretched back through generations of service and sacrifice. Marcus found Princess Elena in the morning room, a chamber that had been decorated in shades of gold and cream to capture and amplify the early sunlight. She sat at a small table near tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, picking delicately at a breakfast of fresh fruit and pastries while reviewing correspondence that had arrived with the dawn. Her auburn hair was arranged in a simple style that somehow managed to appear both casual and elegant, and she wore a morning dress of pale blue silk that complemented her coloring perfectly. When she looked up at his approach, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, though he couldn't have named what it was at the time. Her green eyes held a directness that was both refreshing and unsettling after years of dealing with courtiers who rarely said exactly what they meant. There was intelligence there, and curiosity, and something else that Marcus couldn't quite identify but found oddly compelling. "Captain Blackwood," she said, and her voice carried a warmth that formal court training couldn't quite suppress. "Commander Harrison mentioned you would be joining my detail. I hope Sir Geoffrey's family situation resolves favorably." The simple kindness in her concern for a man she barely knew caught Marcus off guard. Royal courtesy was usually more calculated, designed to create favorable impressions rather than express genuine care. "Thank you, Your Highness. I'm certain Sir Geoffrey appreciates your thoughtfulness." Elena studied him for a moment, her gaze frank and assessing in a way that made Marcus acutely aware of himself as something more than just a uniform and a title. "Have we met before, Captain? You seem familiar, though I can't place where." "I've served in various capacities throughout the palace for several years, Your Highness. Perhaps you've noticed me during state functions or other duties." Marcus kept his voice carefully neutral, though he wondered if she might remember the incident 3 years ago when she had stumbled on wet marble stairs and he had steadied her elbow to prevent a fall. The contact had lasted mere seconds, but her smile of gratitude had stayed with him far longer than protocol would have deemed appropriate. "Ah yes, I remember now," Elena said, and the recognition in her eyes suggested she recalled that same moment. "You prevented me from making an quite undignified entrance to the midsummer ball. I never properly thanked you for your quick thinking." The fact that she remembered such a minor incident, that she had even noticed him enough to recognize his face, created a warmth in Marcus's chest that he immediately tried to suppress. Personal connections with those under his protection were exactly what the protocols existed to prevent. "It was simply my duty, Your Highness. No thanks are necessary." But, even as he spoke the words, Marcus realized that something had shifted between them in that brief exchange. The careful distance that protocols demanded had been bridged by shared memory and mutual recognition, creating a connection that would prove impossible to ignore in the days to come. Elena returned to her correspondence, but Marcus noticed that she glanced in his direction more frequently than purely casual interest would warrant. He maintained his professional stance near the doorway, alert to every sound and movement while trying to ignore the way morning light seemed to find threads of gold in her auburn hair, or how her laugh at something in her letters carried a musical quality that made him want to discover what had amused her. The morning passed with the quiet efficiency that characterized well-ordered palace life, but beneath the surface routine, both princess and guard were becoming aware of each other in ways that the ancient protocols had never anticipated. Neither fully understood what was happening, but both sensed that this day would mark the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about duty, honor, and the carefully maintained boundaries that kept their world in perfect, fragile balance. As the sun climbed higher above the palace towers, casting longer shadows through the corridors and chambers where their story would unfold, Marcus and Elena remained unaware that forces were already in motion that would soon test not only their resolve, but their understanding of where loyalty should truly lie when the heart and duty find themselves in opposition. The stage was set for a collision between tradition and truth, between the roles they had been born to play and the people they were meant to become. And, in the palace gardens, where autumn leaves were beginning to fall like golden tears, destiny waited with the patience of centuries and the inevitability of love itself. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient oak trees that bordered the eastern gardens of Valdoria Palace, creating a natural cathedral where light and darkness danced together in eternal harmony. Princess Elena walked along the winding stone pathway, her afternoon dress of emerald silk rustling softly against the fallen leaves that carpeted the ground in shades of gold and amber. Behind her, at the respectful distance demanded by protocol, Captain Marcus Blackwood maintained his vigilant watch, though he found his attention divided between potential threats and the graceful figure before him. 3 days had passed since Marcus had been assigned to Elena's protection detail, and each day had brought subtle changes that neither could entirely explain. Conversations that began with matters of security somehow evolved into discussions of books, philosophy, and the complex challenges facing their kingdom. Glances that should have been purely professional lingered a moment too long, carrying messages that protocol strictly forbade. The careful distance between them remained physically intact, but, emotionally, something far more dangerous was building. Elena paused beside a marble fountain whose cherubic figures had watched over palace romances for over 2 centuries. The sound of water tumbling over carved stone created a musical backdrop that seemed to invite confidences and quiet revelations. She trailed her fingers in the cool water, watching ripples spread outward in ever-widening circles that seemed to mirror the effects of their growing connection. "Captain Blackwood," she said without turning around, "may I ask you something that has nothing to do with security protocols or royal duty?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken, though his expression remained carefully composed. Personal questions ventured into territory that his training had taught him to avoid, yet he found himself unwilling to refuse her request. "Of course, Your Highness. Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you hadn't been born to serve the crown? If you had been free to choose any path that appealed to you?" Elena's voice carried a wistfulness that spoke of her own struggles with the predetermined nature of royal existence. The question struck deeper than Marcus had expected, touching thoughts he had carefully avoided examining too closely. "I've never known any other life, Your Highness. Service to the crown has been my family's honor for generations. I cannot imagine wanting anything different." Elena turned to face him, and the sadness in her green eyes made Marcus want to close the distance between them and offer comfort that protocol absolutely forbade. "But surely you must have dreams, aspirations that belong to Marcus Blackwood the man, rather than Captain Blackwood the guardsman?" The use of his given name created an intimacy that sent warning signals through every nerve in Marcus's body. Royal family members simply did not address guards with such personal familiarity, and the fact that Elena did so suggested she was beginning to see him as something beyond his uniform and title. "Your Highness, I..." Marcus began, then found himself speaking words he had never intended to voice. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to travel beyond our kingdom's borders, to see the great libraries of the eastern universities or the mountain kingdoms where scholars say the stars shine more brightly than anywhere else on earth. But these are idle thoughts, nothing more." Elena's smile transformed her entire face, revealing a joy that seemed to illuminate the garden around them. "You love learning, don't you? I've noticed how you listen when I discuss the books I'm reading, how your eyes light up when I mention new ideas or discoveries." The observation was accurate in a way that made Marcus uncomfortably aware of how transparent his interest had become. "Education serves duty, Your Highness. The more I understand about our kingdom and the world beyond, the better I can protect those under my care." "Is that truly the only reason?" Elena stepped closer, and Marcus caught the subtle scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. "Or is it possible that Captain Marcus Blackwood shares Princess Elena's belief that knowledge is valuable for its own sake, regardless of how it serves practical purposes?" The question hung between them like a bridge that once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Marcus found himself looking into her eyes, seeing not the princess he had sworn to protect, but a young woman whose intelligence and curiosity matched his own, whose loneliness mirrored the isolation he had never acknowledged even to himself. "Perhaps," he said quietly, the single word carrying more weight than entire conversations they had shared. Elena's smile widened, and, for a moment, the careful barriers between them seemed to dissolve entirely. They were simply two people discovering unexpected connection in a world that had taught them both to expect solitude as the price of their positions. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the cobblestone path that led from the palace stables to the main courtyard. Marcus immediately shifted back into professional alertness, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword while his eyes scanned the approaching rider for potential threats. The horseman who emerged from beneath the canopy of oak trees wore the livery of Duke Wilhelm's household, his mount lathered with sweat that spoke of urgent travel. Duke Wilhelm controlled the northern provinces and was father to Prince Frederick, a young man whose reputation for reckless behavior and entitled arrogance had made him unwelcome in many of the kingdom's noble circles. "Your Highness," the messenger called as he brought his horse to a stop beside the fountain, "Duke Wilhelm sends his compliments and requests your immediate presence in the Blue Salon. Prince Frederick has arrived earlier than expected and wishes to pay his respects." Elena's expression shifted, and Marcus noticed the way her shoulders tensed at the mention of Frederick's name. The prince had been pursuing Elena with increasing persistence over the past year, encouraged by his father who saw a marriage alliance as a way to strengthen his political position within the kingdom. "Please inform Duke Wilhelm that I will attend him shortly," Elena replied, her voice carrying the cool politeness she reserved for situations she found disagreeable. "Captain Blackwood and I were just returning to the palace." As the messenger departed, Elena's composure slipped slightly, revealing frustration that made Marcus want to offer reassurance he had no right to give. Prince Frederick, she said with obvious distaste, possesses all the charm of a summer storm and twice the destructive potential. I suspect this unexpected visit has more to do with his father's ambitions than any genuine desire to see me. Marcus found himself speaking before caution could intervene. Your Highness seems uncomfortable with Prince Frederick's attentions. The understatement drew a laugh from Elena that held no humor whatsoever. Prince Frederick believes that royal birth grants him license to behave however he pleases, regardless of how his actions affect others. He's the sort of man who sees women as ornaments to be acquired rather than people to be respected. The bitter edge in her voice told Marcus there was history behind her assessment, experiences that had shaped her opinion through direct observation rather than court gossip. The protective instinct that arose in response surprised him with its intensity. The protocols require me to maintain appropriate distance during social gatherings, Marcus said carefully, but I will remain alert to any situation that might compromise your safety or comfort. Elena looked at him with surprise that gradually gave way to something warmer and more personal. Thank you, Captain. Your concern means more to me than you might realize. They walked back toward the palace in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts they couldn't fully share. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and formal flower beds that surrounded the ancient structure. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed the hour, reminding them both that duty waited regardless of personal inclinations. The blue salon was one of the palace's more intimate reception rooms, decorated in shades of sapphire and silver that created an atmosphere of elegant formality. When Marcus and Elena arrived, they found Duke Wilhelm holding court near the tall windows that overlooked the western gardens, his corpulent figure resplendent in velvet and gold that spoke of wealth rather than taste. Beside him stood Prince Frederick, whose handsome features couldn't quite disguise the petulant weakness in his blue eyes. At 25, Frederick possessed the kind of golden good looks that made mothers of eligible daughters flutter with excitement, but his character had been shaped by a lifetime of indulgence that had never taught him to consider anyone's needs beyond his own. His smile as Elena entered the room was calculating rather than warm, the expression of a man who saw her as a prize to be won rather than a person to be cherished. Princess Elena, Frederick said, executing a bow that managed to be both technically correct and subtly mocking, you grow more beautiful each time I have the pleasure of your company. Palace life obviously agrees with you. Elena's response was polite but distant, her court training allowing her to maintain appropriate social forms while revealing nothing of her personal feelings. Prince Frederick, Duke Wilhelm, welcome to Valdoria. I trust your journey from the northern provinces was pleasant. Marcus positioned himself near the salon's entrance, close enough to intervene if necessary while maintaining the invisibility that protocol demanded. From this vantage point, he could observe the subtle interplay of politics and personality that characterized palace gatherings, but, more importantly, he could monitor Elena's comfort level as she navigated Frederick's increasingly presumptuous behavior. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of diplomatic maneuvering, with Duke Wilhelm pressing the advantages of closer ties between their regions while Frederick made increasingly personal comments that pushed the boundaries of appropriate court behavior. Elena deflected each thrust with skill that spoke of years of experience dealing with unwanted suitors, but Marcus could see the strain beginning to show in the tightness around her eyes. Perhaps, Frederick said with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted, Princess Elena would honor me with a private walk through the famous palace gardens. I understand the autumn flowers are particularly spectacular this year. The request was phrased as a polite suggestion, but something in Frederick's tone suggested he expected compliance rather than consideration. Elena's hesitation was brief but telling, and Marcus felt every muscle in his body tense as he waited for her response. I'm afraid that won't be possible this afternoon, Elena replied with diplomatic grace. I have several appointments that require my attention before evening. Perhaps we could arrange something during your extended visit. Frederick's smile didn't waver, but Marcus caught the flash of irritation in his eyes that suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his wishes deferred. Of course, Your Highness. I'm certain we'll find opportunities to spend time together during my stay. After all, there are many matters of mutual interest we should discuss. The implied meaning behind his words made Marcus's jaw clench, though he managed to maintain his professional expression. The protective instinct that had been growing stronger each day now reached levels that threatened his ability to remain passive if Frederick pushed too far. Duke Wilhelm, perhaps sensing his son's growing frustration, smoothly intervened to redirect the conversation towards safer topics. The remaining minutes of the visit passed without incident, but Marcus noticed how Elena's posture remained tense until the moment their guests departed. When they were finally alone, Elena sank into one of the blue velvet chairs with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire encounter. "And thus begins another campaign in the endless war of palace politics," she said wearily. "Frederick's father sees marriage to me as a path to greater influence, and Frederick sees marriage to me as his right simply because he desires it." Marcus found himself struggling with the professional distance that required him to remain silent while she dealt with situations that clearly distressed her. The urge to offer comfort, to promise protection that went beyond his official duties, grew stronger with each passing moment. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "if Prince Frederick's behavior becomes inappropriate in any way, please know that your safety and comfort are my primary concerns." Elena looked up at him with eyes that held gratitude mixed with something deeper and more complex. "I do know that, Captain. And I cannot tell you how much that knowledge means to me." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither could fully acknowledge. They were standing at the edge of territory that protocol had marked as forbidden, yet neither seemed able to step back from the precipice they were approaching. As evening shadows began to gather in the corners of the blue salon, both Marcus and Elena realized that their carefully maintained professional relationship was evolving into something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. The arrival of Prince Frederick had served as a catalyst, forcing them to confront feelings that had been growing in the spaces between duty and desire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new temptations to test the boundaries they had been taught to respect. But tonight, in the gathering dusk of a day that had changed everything, they stood together in perfect understanding of what was growing between them, even as they struggled to name it or know what to do with the emotions that threatened to overwhelm everything they had been taught about their proper places in the carefully ordered world of palace life. The stage was set for a confrontation between heart and duty, between the love that was blossoming in secret and the expectations of a kingdom that had no room for such complications. And, in the shadows of the blue salon, where candlelight danced across walls that had witnessed centuries of royal drama, Marcus and Elena began to understand that their story would either end in heartbreak or transform everything they thought they knew about honor, loyalty, and the true meaning of service to something greater than themselves. The harvest moon hung like a golden coin against the velvet sky above Valdoria Palace, its light streaming through the tall windows of the castle's ancient corridors and casting ethereal shadows that seemed to dance with secrets of their own. It was the night of the autumn equinox ball, the most anticipated social event of the season, where nobles from across the kingdom gathered to celebrate another successful harvest and to engage in the delicate choreography of politics and romance that defined palace life. Princess Elena stood before her dressing mirror in the royal chambers, her reflection revealing a vision that would have inspired poets and painters across the civilized world. Her gown was a masterpiece of deep burgundy silk that seemed to capture moonlight and hold it captive within its folds, the bodice embroidered with threads of gold that traced patterns reminiscent of autumn leaves. Her auburn hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that showcased the Valdorian crown jewels, diamonds and emeralds that caught the candlelight and threw it back in brilliant cascades of color. Yet despite her stunning appearance, Elena's green eyes reflected a turmoil that no amount of royal finery could disguise. The past week had brought increasing pressure from Duke Wilhelm and his persistent son Frederick, whose pursuit had become more aggressive with each passing day. Marriage proposals disguised as political necessities arrived with morning correspondence, while afternoon visits became exercises in dodging increasingly inappropriate advances that pushed the boundaries of acceptable court behavior. Through it all, Captain Marcus Blackwood had remained her constant shadow, his presence providing a sense of safety and stability that Elena had come to depend upon in ways that terrified her. Their conversations had grown deeper and more personal with each passing day, revealing shared interests and compatible minds that made the attraction between them impossible to ignore. Yet the gulf between their stations remained as vast as ever, a chasm that no amount of mutual affection could bridge within the rigid structure of royal protocol. Marcus waited in the corridor outside Elena's chambers, resplendent in the formal uniform reserved for state occasions. The midnight blue fabric was adorned with gold braiding that caught the candlelight, while the ceremonial sword at his side bore engravings that told the story of the royal guard's noble history. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his gray eyes held the alertness of a man who understood that tonight would test his abilities in ways that went far beyond protecting royalty from physical harm. The grand ballroom of Valdoria Palace was a testament to centuries of royal grandeur, its soaring ceilings supported by marble columns that rose like ancient trees toward painted heavens where cherubs danced among golden clouds. Massive chandeliers cast warm light over polished floors that reflected the movements of hundreds of guests, their jewels and silk creating a kaleidoscope of color that shifted and swirled with each elegant dance step. Elena made her entrance with the grace that had been drilled into her since childhood, her smile radiant and welcoming as she greeted foreign ambassadors, neighboring nobles, and the countless dignitaries whose presence was essential to maintaining Valdoria's position in the complex web of international relations. Behind her, Marcus maintained his vigilant watch, though he found his attention increasingly focused on the princess herself rather than the potential threats that might lurk among the celebrating crowd. Prince Frederick appeared at Elena's side within minutes of her arrival, resplendent in cloth of gold that proclaimed his wealth and status to anyone who might have doubted his importance. His handsome features were arranged in the confident smile of a man who believed victory was inevitable, and his eyes held a possessive gleam that made Marcus's hand tighten instinctively on his sword hilt. "Princess Elena," Frederick said with an elaborate bow that managed to be both respectful and subtly mocking, "you outshine every star in the heavens tonight. I consider myself the most fortunate man in the kingdom to claim the honor of your first dance." Elena's response was diplomatically perfect, though Marcus caught the slight tension in her shoulders that spoke of reluctance carefully concealed. "Prince Frederick, you are most kind. I would be honored to accept your invitation." The orchestra struck up a waltz that had been popular at court for generations, its familiar melody creating a backdrop for the careful ritual of royal courtship. Frederick led Elena onto the dance floor with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to possess whatever he desired, his hand resting on her waist with a familiarity that made Marcus's jaw clench with barely suppressed anger. From his position along the ballroom's perimeter, Marcus watched the dance unfold with growing unease. Frederick's behavior remained technically appropriate, but there was something in his manner that suggested he viewed Elena as a prize to be claimed rather than a person to be cherished. His conversation was peppered with casual assumptions about their future together, as if her consent were merely a formality to be observed before the inevitable conclusion of their courtship. "You dance beautifully, princess," Frederick murmured as they moved through the intricate steps that court protocol demanded. "I can easily imagine us sharing such moments for the rest of our lives, once our engagement is formally announced." Elena's smile never faltered, though her eyes flashed with barely concealed irritation. "You speak of matters that have not been decided, Prince Frederick. My father values careful consideration in all important decisions." Frederick's laugh held confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Surely you must realize that our union represents the natural evolution of the alliance between our houses? Your father understands the political advantages such a marriage would bring, and I flatter myself that you have not found my company entirely disagreeable." The presumption in his tone made Elena's temper flare, though years of royal training allowed her to maintain her composure. "I find your company perfectly pleasant, Prince Frederick, but I hope you understand that matters of marriage require more than political convenience and social compatibility." "Indeed they do," Frederick replied, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that made several nearby couples glance in their direction. "They require passion, desire, the kind of deep connection that I believe we could discover together given the proper opportunity. Perhaps after the ball concludes, we might find some private space where we could discuss our future more freely." Elena's response was cut short by the conclusion of the waltz, but Marcus had heard enough to understand that Frederick's pursuit was entering a more aggressive phase that could quickly become problematic. As the prince led Elena from the dance floor, his hand lingered on her arm in a gesture that exceeded the boundaries of appropriate public behavior. The evening continued with the ritualized perfection that characterized major palace functions, but beneath the surface elegance, tensions were building that would soon reach a breaking point. Frederick monopolized Elena's attention throughout dinner, regaling the assembled nobles with stories designed to showcase his supposed virtues while making increasingly personal comments about his intentions toward the princess. Marcus remained at his post near the high table, close enough to intervene if necessary while maintaining the professional invisibility that duty required. Yet with each passing hour, he found it increasingly difficult to remain passive as Frederick's behavior grew more presumptuous and Elena's discomfort became more apparent despite her skilled efforts to conceal it. The crisis came during the evening's final dance, when Frederick requested a private moment with Elena on the moonlit terrace that overlooked the palace gardens. Elena's reluctance was obvious to anyone who cared to look, but social protocol made it difficult for her to refuse without creating the kind of public scene that would fuel gossip throughout the kingdom. Marcus followed at the prescribed distance as they made their way through the ballroom's tall glass doors onto the stone terrace where moonlight created a romantic atmosphere that Frederick clearly intended to exploit. The autumn air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of woodsmoke from the city beyond the palace walls and the lingering fragrance of late-blooming roses from the queen's private garden. "Princess Elena," Frederick began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted, "I believe the time has come for us to speak plainly about our future. My father and I have already begun discussions with your advisors about the terms of our union, and I see no reason to delay the official announcement any longer." Elena stepped back instinctively, putting distance between herself and Frederick's advancing figure. "Prince Frederick, I must ask you to understand that I have given no consent to any such arrangement. While I value the friendship between our houses, I cannot agree to a marriage based solely on political expediency." Frederick's expression darkened, revealing the entitled anger that lurked beneath his polished exterior. "Come now, princess, surely you don't expect me to believe that you prefer spinsterhood to a marriage that would elevate your status and strengthen your kingdom? What more could you possibly want than what I'm offering?" "I want to be valued for something beyond my political usefulness," Elena replied with a dignity that made Marcus's heart swell with admiration. "I want to be seen as a person rather than a possession, to be cherished rather than merely desired." Frederick's laugh held bitter mockery that revealed his true character more clearly than hours of polite conversation ever could. "Such romantic notions are charming in stories, princess, but we live in the real world where practical considerations must take precedence over girlish fantasies. You will marry eventually, and, when you do, it will be to someone who can offer you power, protection, and position. I can provide all of these things and more. And if I refuse?" Elena asked quietly, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Frederick's smile became predatory, revealing depths of entitlement that Marcus found deeply disturbing. "I don't think you will refuse, princess. After all, rejection would be most uncomfortable for everyone involved. Your father values peace with the northern provinces, and I would hate for any personal disappointment to affect the harmony between our regions." The thinly veiled threat hung in the moonlit air like poison, transforming what had been presented as courtship into something far more sinister. Elena's face paled as she grasped the full implication of Frederick's words, understanding that her rejection could have consequences that extended far beyond her personal happiness. "You would threaten war over a marriage proposal?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frederick stepped closer, close enough that Elena could see the cold calculation in his eyes. "I would prefer to call it ensuring mutual understanding, princess. Surely you realize that some prizes are worth any price?" It was then that Frederick made the mistake that would change everything. Whether emboldened by moonlight, wine, or simple arrogance, he reached out to grasp Elena's wrist, pulling her toward him with a force that spoke of possession rather than affection. "Let me show you what you would be giving up," he said, his intention clear as he attempted to claim a kiss that Elena had not offered. Elena tried to pull away, but Frederick's grip tightened, his other hand moving to her waist in a gesture that crossed every boundary of appropriate behavior. "Prince Frederick, you forget yourself," she said with as much authority as she could muster while struggling against his superior strength. That was the moment when Marcus Blackwood made the decision that would define the rest of his life. For 300 years, the royal guard had followed protocols that demanded absolute restraint, forbidding interference in the personal affairs of those they protected unless physical danger was imminent. But, as Marcus watched Frederick force his attentions on Elena despite her obvious distress, protocol became irrelevant compared to the deeper imperative of protecting someone he had come to love from harm. "Release the princess immediately," Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the night air with the authority of absolute conviction. Frederick turned in surprise, his grip on Elena loosening enough for her to step away. "Guard, you forget your place. This is a private conversation between the princess and myself." "Your Highness made her wishes clear," Marcus replied, moving closer with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. "I suggest you respect them." Frederick's face flushed with anger at being challenged by someone he considered a servant. "How dare you interfere in matters that don't concern you? I could have you stripped of rank and banished from the kingdom for this insolence. Marcus's hand moved to his sword hilt, not as a threat but as a promise. Your threats mean nothing to me, Prince Frederick. The princess has asked you to stop, and that is all the authority I require. The confrontation reached its climax when Frederick, perhaps driven by wounded pride and too much wine, made the fatal error of lunging toward Elena again. She belongs to me, he snarled, and no common guardsman will prevent me from claiming what is mine. Marcus moved with lightning speed, intercepting Frederick's advance and sending him stumbling backward across the stone terrace. The prince's feet tangled in his elaborate robes, and he fell heavily, his head striking the marble balustrade with a sickening crack that echoed through the night air. For a moment, the terrace was utterly silent except for the distant music drifting from the ballroom and the sound of Elena's rapid breathing. Frederick lay motionless on the stone floor, blood beginning to pool beneath his golden hair in a dark stain that looked black in the moonlight. Marcus knelt beside the fallen prince, checking for signs of life while his mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. Frederick's pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing was shallow but regular, suggesting a serious head injury rather than immediate death. But, regardless of the medical prognosis, Marcus knew that his actions had just shattered centuries of protocol and changed both their lives irrevocably. Elena stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth as she stared at Frederick's unconscious form. Is he? She whispered. He lives, Marcus replied, rising to face her with eyes that held both determination and resignation. But this changes everything, Your Highness. I've broken my oath, violated every protocol that governs the royal guard. There will be consequences that neither of us can escape. Elena stepped toward him, her green eyes blazing with emotions too complex to name. You saved me, Marcus. Whatever the consequences, you protected me when no one else would. The use of his first name, spoken with such warmth and gratitude, made Marcus's heart race despite the gravity of their situation. It was my honor, Princess. I would make the same choice again without hesitation. Their eyes met across the moonlit terrace, and, in that moment, both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Protocol lay shattered at their feet along with Frederick's unconscious form, and the future spread before them like an uncharted territory where old rules no longer applied. In the distance, the sound of approaching footsteps suggested that their confrontation had not gone entirely unnoticed. Soon they would face questions, investigations, and judgments that would test not only their resolve but their understanding of where true loyalty should lie when love and duty find themselves in irreconcilable conflict. But, for now, in the perfect stillness of a night illuminated by falling stars, Marcus and Elena stood together as equals, their carefully maintained barriers finally dissolved by a moment of crisis that had revealed the depth of their connection and the strength of the love that no royal protocol could contain or control. Dawn broke gray and cold over Valdoria Palace, its pale light filtering through the diamond-paned windows of the royal chambers where Princess Elena sat beside her window, still wearing the burgundy gown from the previous evening's ball. Her hair had long since escaped its elaborate arrangement, and her face bore the exhausted pallor of someone who had spent the night wrestling with impossible choices and their inevitable consequences. The events on the moonlit terrace had unfolded with the swift brutality of a summer storm, leaving destruction in their wake that would reshape the very foundations of palace life. Prince Frederick had been carried to the palace infirmary, where the royal physicians had diagnosed a severe concussion that would keep him unconscious for days. Duke Wilhelm had arrived within hours of receiving word about his son's condition, his face a mask of barely controlled fury that promised retribution on a scale that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Captain Marcus Blackwood sat in the palace detention chamber, a spartanly furnished room in the guard quarters where he had been confined pending investigation into the incident that had shattered 3 centuries of protocol. His midnight blue uniform had been replaced with simple gray clothing that marked him as a prisoner rather than a protector, though his bearing remained straight and his gray eyes held no trace of regret for the actions that had brought him to this point. Commander Harrison had visited twice during the long night, his weathered face reflecting the conflict between duty and personal sympathy that made his position nearly unbearable. The Royal Guard had never faced a situation like this, where one of their own had violated fundamental protocols while arguably fulfilling the deeper purpose those protocols were meant to serve. Marcus, Commander Harrison had said during his final visit before dawn, you understand that I cannot simply overlook what happened. The rules that govern the Guard exist for reasons that go beyond individual circumstances. If we ignore them now, everything we've built over centuries crumbles. Marcus had nodded his understanding while privately acknowledging that some things mattered more than institutional stability. I know the consequences of my actions, Commander. I'm prepared to accept whatever judgment is rendered. But, are you prepared to accept that your actions may have doomed the princess to a fate worse than marriage to Frederick? Commander Harrison's question had struck like a physical blow, revealing implications that Marcus hadn't fully considered in the heat of the moment. Duke Wilhelm is not a man who forgives perceived slights, and attacking his son could be construed as an act of war against the northern provinces. Now, as morning light painted the detention chamber in shades of silver and shadow, Marcus found himself confronting the full magnitude of what his moment of protective instinct might have cost not only himself and Elena, but the entire kingdom. Love, he was beginning to understand, could be as destructive as it was transformative when it collided with the carefully balanced structures that maintained peace and stability. In the royal chambers, Elena faced her own reckoning as she prepared for the formal inquiry that would determine Marcus's fate and, quite possibly, her own. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, had arrived with fresh clothing and worried expressions, having heard whispered fragments of the previous night's events through the network of servants who knew everything that happened within the palace walls. "Your Highness," Margaret said carefully as she helped Elena change into a somber dress of midnight blue that seemed appropriate for the gravity of the day ahead, "the entire palace is speaking of what occurred on the terrace. Some say Captain Blackwood saved you from assault, while others claim he attacked Prince Frederick without provocation." Elena's reflection in her dressing mirror revealed a woman who had aged years in a single night, her green eyes holding depths of sorrow and determination that spoke of innocence lost and resolution gained. "Captain Blackwood acted to protect me when no one else would, Margaret. Whatever consequences follow, that truth will not change." Margaret's skilled fingers worked to arrange Elena's auburn hair in a style that conveyed dignity and strength, though her next words carried warning that made Elena's stomach clench with dread. "Duke Wilhelm has demanded an immediate audience with the king, Your Highness. He speaks of justice and compensation, of insults that can only be answered with blood or gold. The northern provinces are wealthy and powerful, and their allegiance has always been conditional." The implication hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Elena understood better than most that royal marriages were tools of diplomacy, that her personal happiness was secondary to the kingdom's stability. Yet the thought of sacrificing Marcus to appease Duke Wilhelm's wounded pride felt like a betrayal of everything she valued about honor and justice. King Edgar Valdoria stood in his private study, surrounded by maps and documents that illustrated the complex web of alliances that kept his kingdom secure in an increasingly dangerous world. At 55, he possessed the kind of weathered dignity that came from decades of making impossible decisions, though the silver in his dark hair spoke of the price such wisdom demanded. Duke Wilhelm sat across from the king, his corpulent frame radiating the righteous anger of a man whose authority had been challenged by someone he considered beneath notice. His demands had grown increasingly extreme as the night progressed, evolving from simple punishment to comprehensive retribution that would satisfy his wounded pride. "Your Majesty," Duke Wilhelm said with barely controlled fury, "this attack on my son represents more than a breach of protocol. It is an assault on the dignity of our house and, by extension, an insult to the northern provinces themselves. Such actions cannot be tolerated without response." King Edgar studied the Duke with eyes that had seen enough of palace politics to recognize manipulation disguised as principle. "Duke Wilhelm, while I understand your concern for your son's welfare, we must be careful not to let emotion cloud our judgment. Prince Frederick will recover from his injuries, and Captain Blackwood will face appropriate consequences for his actions." "Appropriate consequences?" Duke Wilhelm's voice rose with indignation that echoed off the study's paneled walls. "Your Majesty, a common guardsman dared to lay hands upon a prince of royal blood. In any civilized kingdom, such an act would be considered treason punishable by death." The king's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered in his dark eyes that suggested the duke's presumption was noted and filed away for future consideration. "Captain Blackwood is hardly common, Duke Wilhelm. His family has served the crown with distinction for generations, and his personal record is exemplary. Before we discuss punishment, perhaps we should examine the circumstances that led to the confrontation." Duke Wilhelm's face flushed with color that spoke of barely contained rage. "Circumstances are irrelevant, Your Majesty. Protocol was violated, hierarchy was ignored, and my son lies unconscious because your guard forgot his place." I demand justice in the form of Blackwood's immediate execution, followed by Princess Elena's engagement to Frederick as compensation for the humiliation our house has suffered. The boldness of the demand revealed the Duke's true motivations more clearly than hours of diplomatic conversation ever could. King Edgar rose from his chair, his full height and royal bearing transforming him from politician to monarch in a single fluid motion. "Duke Wilhelm," the king said with quiet authority that filled the study like thunder, "you forget yourself. Princess Elena is not a commodity to be bartered in payment for perceived slights, and Captain Blackwood deserves a fair hearing before any judgment is rendered." But, even as he spoke the words, King Edgar understood the delicate position his kingdom occupied. The northern provinces controlled crucial trade routes and commanded significant military resources that would be difficult to replace if Duke Wilhelm chose to withdraw his support. The balance between justice and political necessity was never more precarious than when personal honor collided with national interest. The formal inquiry convened in the palace's Great Hall, a chamber that had witnessed centuries of royal justice and governmental decisions. Representatives from across the kingdom filled the ornate seats while foreign ambassadors observed from designated galleries, their presence transforming a domestic matter into an international spectacle that would influence diplomatic relations for years to come. Elena entered the hall wearing her midnight blue dress with a composure that belied the turmoil in her heart. Every eye followed her progress toward the witness chair, but her attention remained fixed on Marcus, who stood at the defendant's position with the bearing of a man who had made his peace with whatever consequences awaited him. Their eyes met across the formal distance that protocol demanded, and, in that brief connection, Elena found the strength she needed to speak truths that would either save them both or damn them completely. Marcus, for his part, drew courage from her presence, understanding that whatever happened next, she would face it with the same grace and dignity that had first captured his admiration. Lord Chancellor Pemberton, the kingdom's highest judicial officer, called the inquiry to order with the ceremonial gravity that such proceedings demanded. His white hair and lined face spoke of decades spent navigating the treacherous waters where law met politics, and his reputation for fairness was matched only by his understanding of the complex forces that shaped royal justice. "This inquiry," Lord Chancellor Pemberton announced in a voice that carried clearly throughout the Great Hall, "will examine the events that occurred during the autumn equinox ball, specifically the confrontation between Captain Marcus Blackwood of the Royal Guard and Prince Frederick Wilhelm of the Northern Provinces. All testimony will be given under sacred oath, and all evidence will be examined with the thoroughness that justice demands." The first witnesses painted a picture of growing tension throughout the evening, describing Frederick's increasingly aggressive pursuit of Elena and the escalating inappropriateness of his behavior. Palace servants testified to conversations they had overheard, while guests recalled observing the prince's presumptuous conduct during dinner and dancing. When Elena was called to testify, her voice rang clear and strong as she described the events on the moonlit terrace with precise detail that left no doubt about Frederick's intentions or Marcus's motivations. Her testimony painted Marcus not as an aggressor, but as a protector who had acted when all other options had been exhausted. Prince Frederick made his intentions clear, Elena stated with quiet dignity that commanded respectful attention throughout the hall. "When I declined his advances and requested that he respect my wishes, he chose instead to use physical force. Captain Blackwood intervened only when it became apparent that I was unable to defend myself against unwanted assault." Duke Wilhelm's attorney, a sharp-featured man whose reputation for ruthless advocacy had earned him substantial fees throughout the kingdom, rose to challenge Elena's account with questions designed to cast doubt on her credibility and Marcus's motives. "Your Highness," the attorney said with false courtesy that fooled no one, "is it not possible that you misunderstood Prince Frederick's intentions? Perhaps what you perceived as assault was merely enthusiastic courtship conducted in the romantic atmosphere of a moonlit garden?" Elena's green eyes blazed with controlled anger at the implication that she was either naive or deliberately misleading the inquiry. "Sir, I am quite capable of distinguishing between courtship and assault. Prince Frederick ignored my clearly stated wishes and used physical force to restrain me against my will. No amount of romantic atmosphere can transform such behavior into acceptable conduct." The attorney persisted with questions designed to suggest that Elena had encouraged Frederick's advances through her previous social interactions, painting a picture of mixed signals and feminine fickleness that drew sharp objections from the court officers who recognized character assassination when they heard it. When Marcus was called to testify, his voice carried the steady strength of absolute conviction as he described his actions without excuse or apology. He acknowledged violating protocol while maintaining that his primary duty was to protect those under his care from harm, regardless of the source of that harm. "I have served the Royal Guard for my entire adult life," Marcus stated with quiet pride that resonated throughout the Great Hall. "In all that time, I have never placed personal interest above duty or allowed emotion to cloud my judgment." On the night in question, I witnessed Prince Frederick ignore Princess Elena's clearly stated wishes and attempt to force physical contact upon her. My response was guided by the fundamental principle that governs all guard service: the protection of royal family members from harm. Duke Wilhelm's attorney attacked Marcus's testimony with questions about his relationship with Elena, suggesting that personal feelings rather than professional duty had motivated his actions. The line of questioning grew increasingly personal, designed to establish that Marcus had overstepped appropriate boundaries long before the confrontation with Frederick. Captain Blackwood, the attorney said with manufactured sympathy that barely concealed his predatory intent, "Is it not true that you have developed inappropriate feelings for Princess Elena? That your actions were motivated not by duty, but by jealousy and possessive desire?" Marcus met the question with steady eyes that held no trace of shame or regret. "My feelings for Princess Elena are irrelevant to the facts of what occurred. Prince Frederick's behavior was inappropriate and potentially harmful. I acted to prevent that harm, just as I would have acted to protect any member of the royal family under similar circumstances." But, even as Marcus spoke the words, everyone in the Great Hall understood that the inquiry had reached its crucial moment. The question was no longer simply about protocol or even justice, but about the nature of love itself and whether genuine affection could coexist with duty, or whether the two were fundamentally incompatible within the structures that maintained royal authority. The testimony continued through the morning hours, with witnesses painting an increasingly complex picture of events that defied simple interpretation. Some supported Marcus's version of events, praising his courage and commitment to protecting those under his care. Others, particularly those aligned with Duke Wilhelm's interests, suggested that the guard's actions represented a dangerous precedent that could undermine royal authority if left unpunished. As the sun reached its zenith above the Great Hall's stained glass windows, casting colored light across the assembled crowd, both Elena and Marcus understood that they stood at a crossroads where personal truth would collide with political necessity. The inquiry's conclusion would determine not only their individual fates, but the very nature of honor and justice within a kingdom that had always prided itself on both principles. The afternoon would bring final arguments and deliberation, followed by a judgment that would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come. But, whatever that judgment might be, both princess and guard had already discovered that some truths were worth any price, and some loves were strong enough to challenge even the most ancient and established traditions of royal life. In the Great Hall where justice and politics danced their eternal ballet, the stage was set for a conclusion that would either vindicate the power of love to transform duty into something noble and pure, or demonstrate once again that individual happiness must always bow before the inexorable demands of power and position. The Great Hall of Valdoria Palace had never witnessed a more pivotal moment in its centuries of hosting royal justice. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the marble floors, Lord Chancellor Pemberton prepared to deliver a judgment that would either uphold traditional protocol or establish new precedents that would reshape the relationship between duty and conscience for generations to come. The assembly remained perfectly still as the Lord Chancellor rose from his ornate chair, his weathered hands holding a document that contained not just legal findings, but a philosophy about the nature of honor itself. In the witness gallery, Princess Elena sat with hands folded in her lap, her composure masking the turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her if she allowed herself to contemplate all the ways this moment could destroy everything she held dear. Marcus stood at the defendant's position with the same steady bearing he had maintained throughout the proceedings, though those who knew him well could see the tension in the set of his shoulders and the careful control that kept his expression neutral. Whatever judgment awaited him, he had already made peace with the knowledge that he would make the same choices again if faced with identical circumstances. "This inquiry," Lord Chancellor Pemberton began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hushed chamber, "has forced us to examine fundamental questions about duty, honor, and the proper relationship between those who serve and those they are sworn to protect. The facts of what occurred on the night of the autumn equinox ball are not in dispute. Prince Frederick behaved inappropriately toward Princess Elena, ignoring her clearly stated wishes and attempting to force unwanted physical contact. Captain Blackwood intervened to protect the princess, and, in doing so, Prince Frederick was injured. Duke Wilhelm shifted in his seat, his face red with barely contained fury as he waited for the judgment that would either satisfy his demands for retribution or force him to consider more drastic responses to what he saw as an unforgivable insult to his family's honor. "The question before us," the Lord Chancellor continued, "is not whether Captain Blackwood violated protocol by striking a member of royalty, because clearly he did. The question is whether that violation was justified by circumstances that required immediate action to prevent greater harm." Elena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the entire assembly could hear it. Everything depended on how the Lord Chancellor chose to interpret the ancient laws that governed the Royal Guard's conduct, and whether those laws could accommodate situations that their original authors had never anticipated. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, Lord Chancellor Pemberton announced, "This inquiry finds that Captain Marcus Blackwood acted within the broader scope of his duty to protect members of the royal family from harm. While his actions violated specific protocols regarding contact with royalty, they were justified by Prince Frederick's behavior and the immediate threat it posed to Princess Elena's safety and dignity." The Great Hall erupted in whispers and gasps of surprise, though Duke Wilhelm's bellow of outrage rose above all other sounds. "This is intolerable," he shouted, rising from his seat with violence that sent his chair crashing to the marble floor. "You reward disobedience and assault with vindication? What message does this send to every commoner who might dare to raise his hand against his betters?" Lord Chancellor Pemberton's expression remained impassive as he waited for the commotion to subside. When relative quiet returned, he continued with words that would be recorded in legal precedent for centuries to come. "However," the Lord Chancellor said, and Elena felt her heart stop at the ominous weight of that single word, "this inquiry also finds that the relationship between Captain Blackwood and Princess Elena has developed beyond the boundaries appropriate for guard and protected. Personal feelings, regardless of their nobility, cannot be allowed to influence professional judgment or compromise the integrity of royal protection." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, understanding that vindication regarding his actions would come at a price that might prove more devastating than outright condemnation. Elena's face paled as she grasped the implication of the Lord Chancellor's words, realizing that their connection was about to be severed by the same legal system that had just acknowledged Marcus's heroism. Therefore, Lord Chancellor Pemberton concluded, "Captain Marcus Blackwood is hereby relieved of all duties related to royal protection, effective immediately. While he will retain his rank and may continue serving in other capacities, he is permanently forbidden from any assignment that would bring him into regular contact with members of the royal family." The judgment hit Elena like a physical blow, transforming vindication into a punishment that separated her from the man who had risked everything to protect her. She understood the political necessity behind the decision, the careful balance between acknowledging Marcus's justification while preventing future complications, but understanding did nothing to ease the pain of losing someone who had become essential to her happiness. Duke Wilhelm's rage remained unabated by the mixed judgment, his demands for satisfaction growing more extreme as he realized that the formal inquiry would not deliver the retribution he had expected. "This mockery of justice changes nothing," he declared in a voice that carried throughout the great hall. "My son was assaulted by a common soldier, and, if the crown will not provide adequate compensation, the northern provinces will seek satisfaction through other means." King Edgar rose from his throne, his royal authority filling the chamber with presence that reminded everyone exactly who held ultimate power in Valdoria. "Duke Wilhelm, your disappointment with these proceedings is noted, but your threats against the crown are both inappropriate and unwise. I suggest you remember that your provinces exist at the pleasure of this throne, and that pleasure can be revoked." The confrontation between monarch and duke crystallized tensions that had been building throughout the investigation, transforming a legal proceeding into a political crisis that would test the unity of the entire kingdom. Foreign ambassadors shifted forward in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing events that could reshape the balance of power throughout the region. "Your Majesty forgets that the northern provinces control trade routes essential to Valdoria's prosperity," Duke Wilhelm replied with dangerous confidence. "Perhaps it is time for those provinces to reconsider their allegiance to a crown that protects common soldiers over noble blood." The explicit threat of secession hung in the air like smoke from a fire that could consume everything they had built. Elena understood with crystal clarity that her personal happiness was about to become a casualty in a larger conflict between royal authority and provincial autonomy. King Edgar's response came with the measured authority of a ruler who had spent decades navigating such challenges. "Duke Wilhelm, you are free to withdraw your allegiance whenever you choose." However, you should understand that such action would constitute rebellion against the crown, with all the consequences that entails. I suggest you consider your position carefully before making choices that cannot be undone. The standoff between king and duke reached its climax when Prince Frederick himself entered the Great Hall, still pale from his injuries but determined to participate in events that would determine his future. His appearance drew gasps from the assembled crowd, many of whom had assumed his injuries were more severe than they actually were. "Father," Frederick said as he approached Duke Wilhelm's position, his voice carrying a weakness that spoke of genuine suffering, "I have heard enough of these proceedings to understand what has occurred. Perhaps it is time for honesty rather than pride to guide our decisions." Duke Wilhelm stared at his son with surprise that gradually gave way to suspicion. "Frederick, you should be resting. These matters can be resolved without your involvement." Frederick straightened despite obvious pain, his blue eyes meeting his father's with a directness that suggested the confrontation with Marcus had accomplished something that years of privilege had failed to achieve. "No, father. These matters cannot be resolved without acknowledging the truth of what happened that night." The great hall fell silent as Frederick approached the witness chair, his movement slow but determined. When he began to speak, his words carried weight that no amount of political maneuvering could diminish. "I came to Valdoria with the intention of securing Princess Elena's hand in marriage, believing that my desires and my father's political ambitions justified any means necessary to achieve that goal," Frederick admitted with painful honesty. "I pursued her despite clear signs that my attentions were unwelcome, and, when she refused my advances, I attempted to take by force what should only be given freely." The confession sent shockwaves through the assembly, transforming Frederick from victim into a man taking responsibility for actions that had precipitated the entire crisis. Duke Wilhelm's face turned purple with rage at his son's public admission of guilt. "Captain Blackwood acted exactly as any honorable man should when witnessing such behavior," Frederick continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "His intervention prevented me from committing an assault that would have dishonored not only myself, but my family and my provinces. I owe him gratitude, not condemnation." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at Frederick's unexpected courage in admitting truths that could have remained hidden behind political manipulation and family influence. The prince she had dismissed as spoiled and entitled was revealing depths of character that his privileged upbringing had concealed rather than developed. "Furthermore," Frederick said, turning to address Princess Elena directly, "I formally withdraw any claim to your hand in marriage and publicly apologize for behavior that was unworthy of my position and contrary to everything noble rank should represent. You deserve someone who values your happiness above his own ambitions." Duke Wilhelm's protests died in his throat as he realized that his son's testimony had demolished any hope of using the incident to force Elena into marriage or extract political concessions from the crown. Frederick's honesty had transformed the entire situation, removing the leverage that had made his threats credible. King Edgar seized the moment to address the broader crisis with wisdom earned through decades of royal leadership. "Duke Wilhelm, your son has shown more honor in these few minutes than months of political maneuvering could achieve. Perhaps it is time for the northern provinces to follow his example and choose reconciliation over confrontation." The duke's rage gradually gave way to resignation as he recognized that continued aggression would now appear petty and vindictive in the face of his son's noble gesture. The political crisis that had threatened to tear the kingdom apart was dissolving through the simple power of truth acknowledged and responsibility accepted. But, even as the immediate danger passed, Elena and Marcus remained separated by a judgment that recognized their love while forbidding its expression. The Lord Chancellor's decision had saved Marcus from execution and preserved Elena's right to choose her own future, but it had also ensured that their paths could never again officially cross. It was then that King Edgar made the decision that would be remembered as one of his greatest acts of wisdom and compassion. Rising from his throne with the full dignity of his position, he addressed the assembly with words that would reshape royal tradition forever. "These proceedings have revealed truths that extend beyond the immediate questions of protocol and punishment," the king announced with quiet authority. "We have witnessed courage, honor, and love displayed by individuals whose actions remind us why these virtues matter more than any rule written by men who never faced such choices." Elena's heart began to race as she sensed her father building toward a pronouncement that could change everything. Marcus remained perfectly still, afraid to hope for outcomes that seemed too wonderful to be possible. "Captain Marcus Blackwood has served this crown with distinction and honor," King Edgar continued. His actions on the night in question demonstrated not just physical courage, but the moral courage to do what was right regardless of personal cost. Such character deserves recognition, not punishment. The king paused, allowing his words to resonate throughout the great hall before continuing with the announcement that would transform their lives forever. Therefore, it is our royal pleasure to elevate Captain Marcus Blackwood to the rank of Earl, with all the privileges and responsibilities such position entails. As Earl Blackwood, he will be granted lands in the eastern provinces and a seat on our royal council, where his wisdom and integrity will serve the greater good of our kingdom. Elena gasped audibly as she grasped the implications of her father's decision. By elevating Marcus to noble rank, the king had eliminated the class distinction that made their relationship impossible while rewarding the very qualities that had made her fall in love with him. Furthermore, King Edgar announced with a smile that transformed his entire face, "We hereby declare that Princess Elena is free to marry according to the dictates of her heart, choosing a partner based on love and compatibility rather than political convenience. The crown will support her decision, whatever it may be." The great hall erupted in applause and cheers as the assembly recognized that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary, the triumph of love over tradition, of personal truth over political expediency. Elena felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she looked toward Marcus, whose own eyes shone with emotions too powerful for words. Duke Wilhelm, recognizing that his position had become untenable, offered his own grudging acceptance of the king's wisdom. "Your Majesty has handled this situation with justice and mercy," he admitted with genuine respect. "The northern provinces remain loyal to the crown and will support whatever decisions serve the kingdom's greater good." As the formal proceedings concluded and the great hall began to empty, Elena and Marcus found themselves facing each other across a space that no longer contained the barriers that had kept them apart. Protocol had been replaced by possibility, duty had evolved into choice, and love had proven itself stronger than any tradition created by minds that had never experienced its transformative power. "Earl Blackwood," Elena said with a smile that contained all the joy and hope she had been forced to suppress for so long, "I believe we have some important matters to discuss." Marcus approached her with the same steady confidence that had characterized all his actions, though now it was enhanced by the freedom to express emotions he had been forced to hide. "Princess Elena, I would be honored to discuss any matter that interests you." Their hands met in the golden light streaming through the great hall's windows, and, in that simple contact, both understood that they had not just survived their ordeal but had been transformed by it into something greater than either could have become alone. 6 months later, the wedding of Princess Elena and Earl Marcus Blackwood took place in the palace gardens where they had first discovered their love for each other. The ceremony combined royal tradition with personal meaning, creating a celebration that honored both their positions and their journey to find each other against impossible odds. Prince Frederick attended the wedding with genuine joy, his near-death experience having taught him the difference between wanting something and deserving it. His friendship with both bride and groom became one of the unexpected gifts that emerged from their shared ordeal, proving that crisis could create understanding as well as conflict. The kingdom prospered under the wisdom of leaders who had learned to balance tradition with truth, duty with compassion, and power with the recognition that love, properly expressed, could strengthen rather than threaten the foundations of just authority. And, in the palace gardens where their story began, Elena and Marcus built a life together that proved love could indeed conquer all obstacles when it was guided by honor, sustained by courage, and blessed by the understanding that true nobility came not from birth or position, but from the choices made when character was tested by the fires of genuine challenge. Their love story became legend throughout the kingdom and beyond, inspiring countless others to believe that individual happiness and service to something greater than oneself were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a life lived with full integrity and complete commitment to both personal truth and noble purpose. The Royal Guard protocols were revised to acknowledge that protecting those under their care sometimes required defending them from threats that wore friendly faces, and that honor sometimes demanded breaking rules that no longer served justice. The changes ensured that future guards would have the guidance and support necessary to make difficult choices without sacrificing either their careers or their consciences. Elena and Marcus ruled wisely when their time came, their partnership demonstrating that love grounded in mutual respect and shared values could create leadership that served both individual happiness and collective welfare. Their children grew up understanding that true nobility was earned through service and character rather than inherited through bloodline, and their descendants continued that tradition for generations to come. The palace gardens where they had found each other became a place of pilgrimage for lovers throughout the kingdom, a symbol that even the most impossible dreams could become reality when pursued with courage, integrity, and the understanding that love's greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything for another's happiness and well-being. And so their story passed into legend, a testament to the power of love to transform not just individual lives, but entire kingdoms when it was guided by wisdom, sustained by courage, and expressed through service to ideals greater than personal desire. In the golden light of memory and the eternal promise of hope, Princess Elena and Earl Marcus Blackwood proved that some loves are indeed strong enough to change the world, one heart at a time.